Right now, in your kitchen, there's a good chance you're keeping something the Great Depression put there. You just call it comfort food. This is the food Americans invented to get through the hungriest decade the country ever lived through. And one thing the government did in 1933 quietly changed what every dish in this story really means. We'll get to that. First, understand what these families were up against. These weren't wartime ration books. That came later. This was just empty cupboards and no money to fill them. And out west, even the land gave out. On April 14th, 1935, a day people still call Black Sunday, a wall of dust swallowed the sky, and families who had farmed for generations watched their soil blow away. So the question became a daily one. What do you cook when there's almost nothing left? The first rule was simple. Nothing was allowed to go to waste.
Stale bread didn't get thrown out. It got softened under hot flour and water gravy, or warmed in a little milk with a dusting of sugar for the kids. It wasn't much of a meal. Most nights, it was the feeling of one. Underneath the famous recipes was a plainer truth. Beans, cornbread, and potatoes, over and over. Dried beans because they were cheap and they filled you up. Cornbread because a little cornmeal went a long way. Potatoes because they grew almost anywhere. Picture the same three things on your table, Monday through Sunday, dressed up just enough to feel a little different each night. That sameness wasn't a diet. It was endurance, 3 times a day. One of the few people who left us a first-hand record was Clara Cannucciari. She grew up cooking through those years, and decades later she filmed her Depression recipes at her own stove. The one she never forgot was the poor man's meal, potatoes and onion fried up with a sliced hot dog. Cheap enough for the worst week, filling enough to pass for dinner. And when the cupboard was truly bare, people looked at the lawn. Oral histories from the era remember families gathering dandelion greens from yards and parks, a weed most people fought to kill, and turning it into a plate of food that cost nothing. But hunger this deep didn't stay in the kitchen. It spilled into the street. By 1931, the breadline was one of the most common sights in an American city. In it stood men who'd held steady jobs a year before, waiting in the cold for thin soup and a slice of day-old bread. In Chicago, one of the busiest soup kitchens in town was quietly funded by the gangster Al Capone. When the mob is feeding your neighbors, something has broken. The shantytowns that spread on the edge of every city got a bitter name, Hoovervilles, after the president people blamed. The stew cooked in those camps got his name too. Hoover stew was hot dogs, macaroni, canned tomatoes, and corn, boiled together in one pot to feed a crowd for almost nothing. Naming it after Herbert Hoover was about the only revenge these families had left. And as the money itself dried up, food started doing the work money used to do. A neighbor traded eggs for another's milk. A jar of preserves settled a debt. Men riding the rails from town to town pooled whatever scraps they had into one shared pot. A potato, a carrot, a bit of meat if someone got lucky, and called it Mulligan stew. Out in the countryside, dinner had to be caught. Rabbit, squirrel, whatever crossed the field. The jackrabbit that fed so many even earned a grim nickname, the Hoover hog. And still, people wanted to feel human. That meant dessert, even with an empty pantry. So families reached back for older scarcity recipes.
They baked cakes with no eggs, no milk, and no butter, darkened with cinnamon and boiled raisins until the whole house smelled, for one night, like things were normal. There was vinegar pie when there was no fruit. There was water pie, just water, sugar, flour, and a little butter, baked until it set into something sweet. And there was mock apple pie, an old frontier trick where crackers soaked in sugar and cinnamon fooled the tongue into tasting apples that were never there. A pie made of no apples. That's not a recipe. It's a magic act. And business was watching all of this. In 1937, Kraft put a boxed macaroni and cheese dinner on shelves for 19 cents, a hot meal for 4 in 9 minutes. It sold an estimated 8 to 9 million boxes in its first year. Kraft had packaged the one thing every family already knew how to do, turn a little into enough, and it never left the American shelf again. Which brings us back to 1933. And the thing I promised you. All of this scrimping hides a fact that still feels impossible. America wasn't running out of food. It was drowning in it. Even with the Dust Bowl ruining farms out west, the country as a whole was growing more than it could sell. Prices fell so low that crops were left to rot in the field because harvesting them lost money. And in the fall of 1933, the government did something that enraged a hungry nation. To force prices back up, it paid farmers to cut production, including buying and killing around 6 million young pigs. Some of them broke loose and ran squealing down the streets of Chicago and Omaha, while people who couldn't afford dinner stood and watched. The outrage was so fierce that the government scrambled to answer it, processing about 100 million pounds of that pork and sending it to families on relief. That backlash built the first real system in American history for moving surplus food to the people who needed it. Because the problem was never that the food had run out. It was that millions of Americans couldn't afford the mountain of it sitting right in front of them. 6 years later, in Rochester, New York, that idea became the country's first food stamp program. For every dollar of orange stamps a family bought, they were handed 50 cents of blue stamps to spend on surplus food. Over the next 4 years, around 20 million Americans used it at one time or another. And that's what really outlived the Depression. Not the hunger, the habits. Stretching a little meat with a can of soup became the American casserole. That 19-cent box became the mac and cheese in your pantry right now. The whole idea of cheap, keeps forever, feeds everyone comfort food was forged in these years, and the country never stopped eating it. Full employment didn't come back until the war finally pulled the country out, but the Depression stayed in America's kitchens far longer than it stayed in the headlines. These recipes lasted because the people who cooked them refused to let hard times have the last word. Every casserole carried into a funeral. Every box of mac and cheese on a rough week. Every grandparent who still can't throw away the heel of a loaf. That isn't nostalgia, it's memory, handed down through the hands that made it through. So tell me, which one of these did your family actually make? And which one did I miss?